Hey, thanks for having me. We get a lot of questions about how we can use Windows Virtual Desktop to meet compliance requirements in the cloud. But it's actually a lot more than that as well. I mean, it offers us a lot to reduce our footprint, to make security easier, to make compliance easier, to bridge, you know, old networks and new networks. And so it's a fairly powerful tool. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about how it helps you meet compliance, kind of the use cases. And then I'll end by giving you some technical tidbits. We're not going to do a huge technical deep dive, but I want to give you enough that you have an idea kind of how the architecture is so that you could go back with your group and you can make some basic technical decisions. So I'll give you some homework at the end. One of the big challenges of the DIB, is the compliance, security, and availability, quite honestly. So, it's not just enough to be compliant and secure. Users have to be able to get to it. So it really is a combination of that. And CMMC L3 has brought new challenges into it. Things like workstation logging, centralized logging, enforcing multi-factor on workstations beyond the shadow of a doubt, those types of things. And so it's introduced new challenges. Some of those we can actually address with Windows Virtual Desktop. So first, we'll start off today. We can address several of the practice areas in Windows Virtual Desktop, WVD. So if I accidentally say WVD, you'll know what I'm talking about. But the primary ones: access control, configuration management, identification and authentication, media protection, recovery, and system and information integrity. And for fun, I've actually thrown a couple more in there in just a couple of slides. So I won't call out the practice areas the whole time. That's another webinar. So why are we running Windows Virtual Desktop for CMMC? So why would we do that? One of the most obvious reasons is companies, especially with COVID today, companies that have remote workers, right? So not buying every single person a workstation and having them take it home. Or we don't mind buying everyone a workstation, but how do we keep them all updated from home? They're not coming into the office at all. Some employees haven't been to the office, in like 6 or 7 months. So being able to offer that remote employee kind of ease of use, if you will, that is a common reason we're seeing Windows Virtual Desktop. The other one is just simply people who go home after 5 o'clock and they are working in the office, but they need to log in and do something real quick. Well, you can access CMMC L3 systems from a home computer. It would be the rare case. I'll talk about that in just a minute. You've got to access CMMC L3 systems from a compliant machine. And so what Windows Virtual Desktop does in that scenario is it allows a user just to use whatever machine they have at the house and come in via Windows Virtual Desktop. And then they can access Word, Excel, PowerPoint. They can even access Teams, right? So they can do chats. And I'll talk about that a little more later as well. Another common use case we see is companies who have workers that, let's make up some numbers, 80% of their job, is working on a commercial contract, right? And about 20% of their job is working on a government contract. Now, I call these kind of swivel seats, right? Somebody who works in commercial part of the day, but then they also need to work on a DoD contract part of the day. So one of the ways to solve that problem without building that two complete infrastructures, is to let them use their commercial managed machine through a Windows Virtual Desktop that's fully compliant, right? So once we get it into WVD, the file storage is secure. They can still use SharePoint. They can still use OneLine. They have an Outlook. They could have another email address, really the whole 9 yards. And this gives them the ability to have one corporate machine, but be able to work on those DoD contracts as well. We use the same thing for like business development and proposals. I think, that's a common area where we need somebody to come work on our bid, our team. This is a way we can give those other partners, access to work on those proposals with us. Another common reason this is very common as well. There's a lot of really good use cases here as contractors, right? So a lot of companies want to restrict what contractors can do. So they don't want to just hand them a machine, or they don't want to spend the full expense of a machine. Maybe it's a contractor that is IT support, let's say, and they need 5-10 hours a week. So giving them a very elastic service like Windows Virtual Desktop makes a ton of sense cost-wise. And we can completely control their access to files and data and so forth. Another reason, and this gets into, I think, smaller businesses a lot of times where they don't have a full-time security and compliance person. Virtual Desktop allows us to create these stores, SharePoint Online, or even a file share. We still have some things that run off of a file share, and we only use it online. We essentially create what's called an enclave. I'll talk about that in more detail later, but hold on to that word. But it allows them to come in and easily manage it, right? This way, they're not afraid of where data is going or what am I managing or who are my employees. And so it really is a way to keep everything in one place. It's a very appealing thing for everybody, but we do see that a lot in smaller businesses. We had a contract lately where, they won a contract. And our customer needed to onboard several hundred users in a matter of a couple of weeks. Windows Virtual Desktop was perfect. We were able to build an image, and then that customer can rapidly roll out those virtual desktops. Right? It literally, you could go from 200 to 500 in a day. That's about the only way you could bring 300 users. Now, I don't know about your help desk calls for 300 users, but as far as our job at Azure, we could pretty easily provision those workstations. What's interesting on that same client, they're actually going to come back over time and replace some of those with workstations, right? They've ordered workstations. See, the problem is they can't bring on hundreds of laptops at one time. So bringing everybody into WVD and then transition them, probably 2/3 of those users will transition off of a virtual desktop and onto a physical machine. So this really gives us that ability to do rapid deployment, really eases, those types of, whether it's a contract win, whether it's an M&A activity. The next thing we see this a lot is large scale migration. So it's kind of similar to what we were just talking about, but it's when we need to move from an old system, it's a data center, it's on-prem, and they're trying to move to Azure Gov. It's really hard to do what we call a big bang approach for everything, where you have to bring your IaaS stuff over, your PaaS stuff over, your Azure SaaS stuff over, 365 SharePoint Exchange. What we like to do is we'll use Windows Virtual Desktop to ease that. So what we'll do is we'll move the domains, we'll get everybody into the new GCC High tenant, and we can use Virtual Desktop to access the legacy tenant, going back the other direction, right? So this is a great tool to have in your toolbox. It's very reasonably priced, and it's actually pretty easy. I always joke the last thing this does is protect us from Russia, China, North Korea, and COVID, right? There's a lot of security in here. Microsoft's tracking those malicious IPs and suspicious IPs and those restricted FQDN. See, all of those are requirements by CMMC L3. Microsoft's providing that for us, big part of it for us in the cloud. And COVID, it's just because it allows us to have remote workers work from anywhere securely. See, one of the interesting things before COVID is a lot of DoD contractors, they were not comfortable with people working from home. Well, that had to change. We had no choice. We had to evolve. The DIB has taken this huge step forward, and we've proven that we can have remote workers working securely. A good first step for that is a virtual desktop type solution. Let's talk about managed services and managed devices. A very common scenario I see is people coming in from home and working or uploading files and downloading files. And the problem is you can't attach a home machine to a CMMC L3 system, right? I hear companies say, we're going to do BYOD. By the way, you almost can't do BYOD and be 100% compliant, not even on a mobile. You can, but you got to have a lot of really good governance. So Windows Virtual Desktop helps fix that problem, right? From a machine. If you look at IA.3.083, it's on your screen. It tells us that we need to multi-factor all of the time, basically, right? Even over a VPN. And here's why. Let's say you MFA'd over a VPN. You could still gain access to systems you're not supposed to have, right? Or somebody could tunnel through that. The others, let me throw out a couple more, is AU.2.041, 3.048, and 3.048, all in the audit. And it says all actions should be traceable and protected on the system. Well, if you're coming from your home machine, we have no way to trace it. We don't know what's on your system, right? There's no good way for us to enforce multi-factor on that. This is true, the BYOD, whether it's a commercial, another commercial laptop you own, or whether it's from home. Even configuration management forces us into this managed device, right? If you look at CM2061, CM2064, and CM3067, it talks about enforcing security and maintaining baseline configurations for all devices, right? That means every single device we have a configuration for it, and we're enforcing security and compliance on that device. Well, obviously, if you're BYOD or coming from home, it's highly unlikely. There's probably a couple of you out there saying, well, what if I load our security software on the home machine or on the BYOD mobile, we go ahead and we install the portal app? That's fine, right? I think you could make it compliant, but it's rare that works out very well. We have another requirement, and it is CM.2.063, and that is control and monitor user installed software. Again, hard to do on a home machine. We have a whitelist, blacklist requirement, CM3069. We have, controlling mobile and removable devices and media. It's on your screen, MP2 119, 120, 121. I mean, even coming down in the PS 2128, the ability to lock and erase a system immediately after termination transfer. This is a big deal. Somebody gets fired, they move. CMMC L3 says you've got to immediately be able to lock down that data, control the flow of CUI immediately. If it's on their home machine, we have no way to do that. Again, virtual desktop, that environment they're working in from home, we can go push a button. They're locked out of everything, right? We can immediately meet this requirement. And even coming into some obvious ones like safeguarding CUI at alternate work sites, if you look at those requirements, again, that forces us into managed machines. Now, a lot of people are going to use Intune, right, in Azure Gov, and they're going to manage Win 10 devices as managed devices, and that's great. We do that a lot too, but having Windows Virtual Desktop in the tool bag is a big benefit as well. So let's talk about kind of a Windows Virtual Desktop and how you're going to build this in the cloud, kind of what you need to plan for. Well, first of all, you've got to have a fully compliant Azure in place, right? So you can't just go in and drop in Virtual Desktop and make it secure. You need that foundation secure, right? So things like key vault and encryption, firewall, your NSG, your SIM connections, your storage accounts, your storage groups, all of that's got to be in place, be secured, your subscription secured, your firewalls in place. So all of that needs to be in place and get ready for something like a virtual desktop. So I'm going to assume all that's done as we move through this architecture, right? So the first thing we have to do is design for peak. And you're saying, well, what? That was the same problem I had on hardware. We had to buy this huge server, and most of the time we use 10% of it. Well, the great thing here is we design for peak, but we only pay for what we use, okay? So what we want to do is to build a service that'll reach our peak user load, and it's very elastic, okay, if you will. And there's 2 or 3 ways to do that. I'll chat about that in a second. Things like total users, what hours do they work? How many hours a day, are they working in different systems? And then we have to decide things like, are you going to do a pool? Are you going to have users share, virtual machines, or are you going to have like dedicated machines? And there's a reason for both of those. And we'll get into that. The other thing before you get too deep in the architecture is we need to tightly integrate virtual desktop with security. I think a mistake that we see too often is they'll build out something like Windows Virtual Desktop. Then afterwards they come and apply security and it breaks, right? Or it affects the usability of the system, right? So, I highly recommend to get the security right from the very beginning. and just bake it into your whole process, right? So when you're doing user testing, user acceptance testing, the security is already in place, because we've seen things like impossible travel pickup. Oh, yes, right. Because we came into this other IP address, and then also saw us come in from maybe a mobile phone in a different state. And so you could throw alerts, false positives in your security systems. So make sure that we had that baked in the process from the beginning. A couple of things I really like to do. I love the Microsoft Threat Intelligence for the suspicious IPs and the FQDNs. I also really like the Cloud App Security in conjunction with Windows Virtual Desktop, right? MCAS, MCAS. And that allows us to govern uploads, downloads, users. We can even proxy traffic off of WVD and monitor content in flight, right? So a very powerful combo with Microsoft's CASB and Windows Virtual Desktop, and even conditional access policies, right? So a common one we have and we implement is, hey, if you're not in the USA, you can't log in as an administrator, right? So that type of, I call it geo governance. So those types of things, to get that included in your design from the very beginning. So as we move into Windows Virtual Desktop, you can see on your screen there kind of the basics. Most people will need Windows Server Active Directory. You're going to need Azure Active Directory and AAD Connect to connect the two. So that's where most people are going to be. There is a way to do it all domain services, but that's not most people, because we have other CMMC requirements that already mandate a domain controller. It's kind of just easier to do that than go ahead and build out domain services and pay all that as well. We're already paying for a domain controller. So let's use that solution, but it's totally up to you. And the requirements should drive that design. As you see on your screen, there's three primary methods here. We can have a user in Windows Server Active Directory and the virtual machine. So it's up in Azure, right? But that machine's connected to your Windows Server AD, and the users are being served out of Windows Server AD. That's doable. Very common, by the way. The next one is we can have the user in Windows Server Active Directory, but the machine attached to Azure AD, or AD domain services, I should say. And then last, we can have the user and the virtual machine to domain services. Okay. But like I said, most of what we're seeing, people have domain controllers in the cloud anyway. And so we're kind of seeing that model first. There's really two types of host pools. So first, what is a host? Well, first of all, a host is simply a virtual machine, and a host pool is a collection of virtual machines, or pooled virtual machines, right? So a host machine, host pool, and then what we have is a host pool type. I want to pause because I want to make sure you get this. We have two options here. We have personal, and that personal option means a user logs in, they get their VM and they're locked into it. It's a one-to-one. Something like computer-aided drafting, CAD is a good reason for this. Anything with, we need to do a dedicated GPU or burst rate. I'll show you that too in a minute. So some of those, most people, the vast majority, I love to make up numbers, 96% of people, right, are going to be using that pooled. What pooled does is allows us to get two or more hosts, and as users come in, load balance them across those. Okay. Now there's two different ways. There's two different ways to balance those users. Okay. One is called breadth first. So let's say that we have 4 servers or 4 hosts, and as users come in, it's going to put them on 1, 2, 3, 4, right? It's just going to keep round robin them, setting those down on the servers. The other way to do it is we could do depth first. So let's say that we set a maximum of 12 users. We could go ahead and put 12 users on the first server, and then it goes to the next server. Okay, so that's probably a little bit cheaper. We don't have as many servers spun up, but the breadth as a service is going to give us the most flexibility and react rapidly. That depth, let's fill up one first. That depth first is going to be a little bit cheaper. By the way, let me give you a tip here. Only use one host image per host pool. So let's talk about images. So an image is literally a Windows image, right? It's a Windows image that a user logs in and they're assigned an image, and that's the machine they're functioning on. The reason we say only use one image per host pool is otherwise a user could log in and get one image and the next time they get another. So unless it's April 1st, let's keep, we like to use one per host pool. There's some new stuff coming out. I'll talk about that in just a minute that could change that rule a little bit. When we're doing the host pool configuration, there's a couple of things to get right. The max sessions is a big deal. It can't be changed, right? So this is one of those things to where when we configure it, it can't go change. So we talk about, measure twice, build once, and then we do the load balancing algorithm we just talked about. Now, what's interesting here is the RDP settings will override a GPO. So GPOs, the RDP settings will override that. So a little tidbit. So on your screen here, you can see I've got this architecture drawing, this virtual desktop example scenario. And in here, you can see that we have these desktops in the subnet. They're running on hosts in Azure. We've got a gateway in front of them. You can see that shared storage on the back end. There's several different types of storage, right? We can use the file share off of a server. I mean, nothing keeps us from putting a virtual machine in there, cranking up a file share and store our profiles there. We can even use NetApp storage in Azure, right? Super fast, very cool. That works as well. So when we talk about supported operating systems, these are the operating systems we can run inside of a virtual machine, right? So inside of Windows Virtual Desktop, you'll see on your screen, Windows 10 multi-session, by the way, that's only supported in Azure. So don't go run multi-session on some other machine you have. It's only supported in Azure. 10 Enterprise, you can see it's 1809, which is pretty standard nowadays. Windows 7, not Windows 8, which is, I think we all know why. Windows 7 is still out there and Windows 8 is not supported. Windows Server 2019, 16, and 2012. And I think that's really interesting, right? Because let's say that, we have developers who need a machine to test on, but it must be server. So this is supported, so we can still build those. Oh, by the way, it does not support Windows 10 Enterprise N or KN. So just make sure you get your licensing right. Now, what about the supported remote desktop clients? So what clients are supported to come in and use those operating systems, right? Well, first is Windows, and it is the newer technology, the remote desktop service. It doesn't support mstsc.exe. Now, most of you don't know what that is, but if you're my age and been in IT, it's kind of sad. That was always the remote desktop client. You would go run mstsc and hit return. There's a web browser access as well. So you can come in just via HTML, and you can actually fully use a machine in the browser. Very cool. There's a client for Macintosh. It works great. And Android, iOS. I have one on my iPad. I can crank up my iPad. I go and hit my virtual desktop, and then I get a multi-factor. I multi-factor, and I log in. So that is actually really cool, though. I've got a big iPad. That way I don't always have to have my machine with me, but I always have access to Visio and Outlook and PowerPoint and those files that I need, because when I log in to my desktop, I've got my OneDrive, I've got my SharePoint Online, and I'm seeing all those files. So it's just like I was back in my office without carrying a full machine. People that know me know I like to travel very light. So let's talk a little bit more about host pools. Host pools are just a collection of virtual machines. The session host, the session host is the remote desktop worker, and it provides this service to end users. So don't run personal and pooled on the same, you can't run it on the same host pool. I don't think so right now. I couldn't make it work anyway. So maybe you can. Somebody may email me and say, hey, we made that work. So basically, if you have a pooled image where users are coming in and lots of users using that one pooled image, if you have somebody coming in a dedicated, create another image for them. You're probably going to anyway, because there's going to be an image with, Solid Edge or something else on it, right? So this isn't going to be an issue for you, but just something to remember as you move through your design. Think a lot about virtual machine sizing. You see on your screen, there's a lot of bullets. I'm not going to talk about all of those. But Microsoft highly recommends premium SSD storage for OS disks. I 100% agree, right? So your users will thank you. For CAD, there's several GPU optimized virtual machines. Right now I think it's the only way to get the high-end NVIDIA cards, and so you can get that through those GPUs. GPU virtual machines. There's always also a B series, and that's a burstable machine that's very flexible, allows you to quickly you get a lot more CPU and memory and capacity, and that's kind of a really cool option as well. Now we generally put 10 to 15 users. I think the maximum is 16. Don't quote me on that, per host, right? So you're going to need a VM for every 10 to 15 users. They put a lot of recommendations you'll see on CPUs and cores. Now, I didn't know this, right? So in Azure, I see CPUs and cores, and I'm an old data center person, but those cores are attached, are essentially a one-to-one physical map, by the way, on that Azure virtual machine. And so that's pretty cool tidbit. So cores are very powerful. Virtual CPUs are truly a virtual CPU. Now, here's one thing that works in commercial that we don't have yet in GCC High, but I want to make sure that it exists, right? And it's called Teams AV redirection. By default, I have a Teams client, and when I connect, running on my virtual machine, so when I connect, I get that video and voice lag, right? Because the video and voice are running in the VM, and I get that lag. So it's called AV redirection. In commercial, what we can do is it actually bypasses that remote connection to Azure, and it allows your host to connect directly to Teams, which is really cool, right? So the rest of it's going to the cloud. Essentially, we bypass it for Teams, so you have no lag, and your video and voice works. I don't know if it's coming to Azure Gov. I kind of hope so. Oh, if you go to do that, the documentation says it's supported for GCC High, and then it says it's not supported for GCC High. So I'll clear that up. It's not supported for GCC High. The other thing that is new, pretty cool, but new, is what's called app attach, right? So when we're in virtual desktop, our profiles, live outside now, outside of the desktop itself. And we bring that in as we log in. Now we're even getting the ability to have our applications live outside of this. So when a user logs in, their applications come in and their profile comes in together for a user experience. It does take a little longer to spin up. It gives us a ton of flexibility. I really think this is going to allow us to have one or two or very few images, and based on the user, load up the apps that they need. So actually, it's really cool. It's new. Haven't got to play with it a lot yet. Otherwise, what do we have to do? We either have to have an image that has all of your corporate apps. It's fat, right? And then as users log in, you hide what they don't need. Or you've got to have an image for each persona. So if you've got 12 personas, you have 12 images, right? So this is going to allow us to run that number down. Last, I want to talk just a little bit. I know I went a little lower, but I want to talk about enclave. I hear this word thrown around easily, and I'm not sure it means what you think it means, right? So in my world, I'm an old school security professional. An enclave is an accreditation boundary, and that accreditation boundary we're talking about is that CMMC L3 accreditation boundary. So what we're saying is everything inside of that boundary is an enclave. So in theory, you could have GCC High, you could have Windows Virtual Desktop. Those users use all of the 365, including Teams, not quite as fast as it might be one day, but they can use all of those tools. And that keeps that user in an enclave, right? So that user can sit in their office that is not CMMC L3, but it can only use the internet from that office. And I think this is the gotcha that people don't think about in an enclave. That machine can't attach to local printers. It can't attach to that camera. It can't attach to that, other plotter or that manufacturing machine, right? So it's got to stay in the enclave. So if you want printing, you either got to put a printer on that machine, or you've got to put a small network in an enclave on-prem, little one, that has your peripherals on it for, say, 10 or 15 people to use. Now, there's going to be some people that disagree with what I just said. That's okay. The practice areas sometimes are a little vague, but that's how I see it. I think we'll be fine on that. So just think about enclave. It's on your screen, printing cameras, USB drives, and then we have to make that decision also about audio, video, and are we going to share that? So that's it for today. I hope to come back, talk even more about this in the future. Hey, thanks for having me.